welcome to our training of 5 elements for a robust security strategy. By way of introduction, my name is Emily Jarvis, and I'm the Senior Manager for Events here at GovLoop. And today I have the added pleasure of also being your moderator. So thanks so much for joining me. And a special thank you to our partners at CrowdStrike, Cloudflare, Juniper, and Beyond Trust for helping us put on this session today. So let's get right to it because agencies are tasked with protecting their networks from cyber attacks, but there's no longer a perimeter that makes that easy to defend. So instead, agencies need to rethink how they secure every device connecting to an agency's network. And considering the number of connected devices well north of the hundreds of thousands, probably closer to millions, it's best to ensure sound security. So today our experts will share their lessons learned and best practices on how to craft a strong cybersecurity strategy. But before we jump into all of that, I do have a few housekeeping items to share. First things first, we have some great resources for you on the console under the resources tab along the bottom panel. This is also where you can see our speakers and a little bit more information about them. So make sure you check that out. If you need access to the closed captioning feature, just look for that show captions icon on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Of course, we hope you don't have any technical difficulties, but if you do, send us a message through that Q&A tab and my colleagues will get your questions sorted out. And it's in that same portal where you could ask our experts questions. So don't you dare be shy. Put your questions in early and often. You can also chat with your fellow Govies using that chat button in the bottom panel. Finally, we are recording this session so you can check your inboxes tomorrow because we'll email you a link so you can watch the entire session on demand. All right, with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let me introduce you to our speakers. And we've got a lot of them. So buckle up, friends. First up, we've got Bryce Carter, the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Arlington in Texas. We also have Jared Edgar, who's the Chief Information Security Officer for the state of Idaho. We have Kevin Green, who's the Chief Security Strategist for Public Sector at Beyond Trust. Anish Patel, who's the Head of Federal Civilian at Cloudflare. We have Christian Rodriguez, who's the Field CTO of the Americas at CrowdStrike, and Tom Van Meter, who's the Senior Director for Solutions Engineering at Juniper Networks. Thank you all so much for being with us today. And to better understand each of our speakers' security journeys, I sat down with them for a one-on-one fireside chat. So here are those stories. Here to talk about all things cybersecurity is Bryce Carter. He is the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Arlington in Texas. Bryce, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, Emily, thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right. So cybersecurity, this is not a small topic. In fact, it's massive. So talk to me about what you see as some of the top priorities right now for government cybersecurity professionals like yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's going to differ a little bit depending on, whether it's state, local government, things like that. Everyone's going to have a different set of risks. I mean, there's some things that definitely overlap. For Arlington, it's preparation for the World Cup, which is coming up next year. So yeah, that puts us on the international stage. It's going to be pretty big event here in North Texas. But with that becomes all kinds of cyber risks, right? And they're not really different than our traditional risks outside of the, you've got the international stage coming to the region. So I think for most, just generally speaking, or broadly speaking, it would be kind of risk quantification would be one of the big things, being able to show, these are the risks that we have throughout the organization. Here's some of the impacts of those things. Both qualitatively and quantitatively. And I try not to put too much on the quantitative part because in government, right, we bring in tax revenue technically no matter what, for better or worse. And with that, right, that you can't really say it directly impacts revenue, but it definitely impacts your mission, and
Sure.
that is why government exists, to deliver services and upon its mission. So that's a big part of it. And then for us, definitely, and this is probably going to be a lot different when some of the state governments, but
Mhm.
I'd say the operational technology and SCADA. So, the things that run your water systems or run your power systems or run your traffic system, that's actually a big one for state governments.
Yeah.
All of that, right? It was never really developed with kind of security in mind. So there's a lot of backtracking we have to do on that front. And then, we can't come into a session and not talk about AI. So we got to talk about
No,
AI.
no.
Yep, got to talk about it. So AI security, and I like to call it AI security and enablement, because at the end of the day, if security doesn't align with it, the folks are going to do it anyways, and they probably already are. So it's about betting that sort of into design and educating folks as well, and then also setting your policies. I think the policies are good, but at the end of the day, it's actually getting out there and interacting with your constituents and those that you serve. And then obviously SaaS security and third-party risk management. That's a huge, huge one. And those two things are correlated together. So
Yeah.
the AI security, right? For the most part, government doesn't build its own models. We don't train our own models. I mean, we don't have the near amount of funding for that. No one really does. And if you do, please let me know, because I want to take some of that funding. So yeah, that's a big one for us. And I would say, like, the traditional third-party risk management, I mean, it's just terrible. It's a one-time checkbox kind of thing. So I think a new approach to that is what we're working on as well. So I think those are some of the top of mind things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I didn't forget that the World Cup is coming, but it's crazy that it's just a year away.
Yep,
It
yep,
feels like we just had one, but obviously not. So that is definitely exciting.
yep,
We're hoping to catch a game, possibly. I don't know. Tickets are
yeah.
crazy, but we'll see. All right. So you kind of hinted at this a little bit already, but what are some elements that should be part of a robust security strategy? If you're hearing what you were just kind of talking about the landscape, what can folks do to implement some of these kind of best practices?
Yeah, so I think security has kind of evolved into being more of a strategic game at the end of the day. And I probably shouldn't call it a game, but I mean, you get my drift,
Yeah,
right?
I
So,
do.
your CISO, your security team needs really representation at all levels. So I think everything that you do is probably going to fail unless you are kind of like I don't want to call it a leech. That sounds bad. Unless you're kind of in all these different levels of decision making,
Yeah.
right? So whether it's budget processing,
Mhm.
organizational planning, maybe you have an innovation committee, things like that. So I'm embedding security into that strategic planning, because I mean the problem with security, it used to be very reactive.
Yeah.
And with reactive, we're doing it after the fact. We need to do it beforehand and by design, so we're actually enabling and empowering, instead of being like, oh no, we got to go
Yeah.
back and do security, right? Because that's not only costly, but it does not work very well.
Right. Right.
Because at the end of the day, it usually becomes a risk decision, like, oh, we can't do this because we really didn't consider it at the
Yeah.
start.
Or
Um,
people go around it, like you said before, with the AI things, and they're using tools that haven't been vetted or looked at all.
Yeah, and I can't say that tools solve that problem 100% either,
Oh,
right? Because at the end of the day, I could spend, three, $400,000 a year on so many different security tools, and they get off their city computer and they get
yep,
onto like a personal mobile device, and they can enter whatever they want into a
yeah,
personal chat GPT agent. So it's basically bring your own AI kind of thing, and we're kind of
yeah,
having to evolve around that.
yeah. That makes a whole lot of sense. All right. So where can folks go wrong if they are trying to stay as up to date as possible, if they're trying to embed things into the process and the tools from the get-go? Where else can folks go wrong when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, what I typically see, especially from more technical leaders, is just tossing more tools at the problem.
Yep.
And that's a huge one. And tools don't solve every, no, don't get me wrong. Some tools are good, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, good security means good governance, education, a risk-based approach. If I mean, you're throwing darts at a dartboard if you're just throwing a tool at it. And even then, tools still need people to manage them.
Hmm.
And a lot of times we don't take that into account either. So it's kind of a two-phase problem. One, it's throwing the darts at the dartboard kind of thing with security tools, but then also, not giving enough labor to actually, run those tools effectively. But at the end of the day, is it really hitting your major risk points? And it's going to be a little bit different for every local government, depending on what you have. Like some have power utilities, and that's a very different risk profile than some of the other things.
Right.
So, I mean, you need to be taking a risk-based approach to that.
That makes a whole lot of sense. All right, two final questions for you here, Bryce, and I appreciate you running through these
Sure.
with me. So, you mentioned here at the top AI has entered our sphere, but other technologies have really come in the last decade, as well as kind of new security models. There's zero trust, you had
Sure.
continuous diagnostic before it. So, what changes have you seen really evolve over the last decade or so, and how's that impacting our current security apparatus?
Yeah, I think it's a huge shift away from the legacy on-prem infrastructure
Yeah.
stuff where, you'd have to have your IT team go install stuff, put in a
Mhm.
database and all that jazz, right? Nowadays, you just need an email address and password and you can set up a SaaS platform in seconds.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we've seen with the major shift from. I think in addition to that, we've seen a lot of transition away from, and I think it's still focused on that, but I'm hoping we get a more transition away from it. But I think it is slowly, but just away from compliance checkboxes, right? Because that, truth be told, is pretty much everyone that has had a data breach, even in the private sector, has checked every single compliance box, but it didn't actually do anything to their operational security or how they embedded it in their organization.
Yeah. All right. So, our theme for this event is really around this idea of things that agencies and departments can do differently to better their cybersecurity in
Sure.
2025. And there are a lot of different strategies and
Mhm.
policies and tools that you could put in place to help. But I'm curious from your perspective, what have you seen really work to help transform? Let's talk about like the organizational culture around security, if you have any best practices there.
Yeah, so I think it all kind of starts with culture, and then the technical side comes along with it afterwards. So honestly, it's developed, it's elevating your security teams, and some don't have security teams. So in that case, it's your IT team to being more
Sure.
of a strategic partner. So, again, ensuring the representation on all those different levels of decision making. But I think too, us as leaders have to change
Mm,
because it's always like we're bringing our technical game in, which is good, but that's not necessarily aligned with the way the organization is aligned or their direction. So I think it's aligning where you're going from a cyber perspective with the goals that you're trying to meet. And in Arlington, one of the things we do is try to align our cybersecurity KPIs or key performance indicators with those business goals as well. And we
wonderful.
could probably spend an hour on this topic.
And I'm sure everyone would love that. But unfortunately, we are out of time. But Bryce, I want to give you one opportunity for a closing thought here. I think when we talk cybersecurity, the ideas and themes can get so big picture. What
Sure.
takeaway would you have for folks listening to the discussion? What do you want them to be thinking about when it comes to security?
Sure. So I think, at the end of the day, you're a risk manager. You're a risk manager, but you're a business leader. I know business leaders not what we typically call ourselves in government, but at the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's kind of it's run kind of like a business in many ways. So I think it's you've got to bring your business game to the table, but then be able to align security with that. And you need to be able to understand where your risks are and where it could impact that mission. So that could be going out and getting a third party risk assessment or a third party to do a risk assessment,
Yeah.
and you bringing that back to the home base and just keeping that in the back of your head as you're going through these meetings with folks, because at the end of the day you want to be hitting on the things that are most important to your organization and what your biggest risks are. If you're not doing that, then it's the darts at the dartboard situation again, and you're falling into line with what a lot of vendors want you to, which is to buy their product, which is fine, and there's good products out there, but again, it needs to be aligned with a strategic direction
Yeah.
and your biggest risks.
Yeah. And you definitely should not play darts with me because I am an awful dart player. So I'm basically a cybersecurity threat just walking around in this analogy. So, Bryce, I really appreciate your insights and thanks for sharing them with us today.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on.
Here to talk about all things cybersecurity is Jared Edgar, who is a Chief Information Security Officer with the state of Idaho. Jared, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, so cybersecurity, not a small topic and definitely an essential one. So, lay the groundwork for me. What are some of the top priorities that you and your colleagues are kind of seeing and working on right now when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, so here across, in Idaho and also just probably other states, what we're really focusing on is that shift towards resilience. And so we've got kind of three areas that we're focused on with that. Is one is developing our people, the next is optimizing our data, and the third would be scaling our systems. And I'll elaborate a little bit more. So when I talk about developing our people, we're really talking about working with our culture and moving it in a direction which understands cyber a little bit more fundamentally, but also understanding like why we're doing these things versus like just, oh, they're mean things and they're happening. The other
Yeah.
thing that we're working on throughout Idaho is developing strategic partnerships. So whether that's with military or with state and local governments, the colleges, we have national labs, we have private sector, we have power utilities, things like that, is working to build those strategic partnerships. And the last thing would be on is developing opportunities to build competency. And so one thing here in Idaho we have going on for us is an apprenticeship program where we're launching out to actually place people in developmental assignments while we solve problems. On data optimization front, what we are looking at is basically understanding what is the value of our data, and then also in plain speak, coming up with common frameworks to actually define what data is. And one thing I appreciate in other states have is that we have a broad definition of like what data means and how valuable it is. And so coming up with that kind of common language we can use to understand like the value on it. And then the last thing would be is understanding how we actually protect it. Like what are those things we're going to put in front of it to prevent it from leaking out. And the last thing is really gets into that kind of business objective is economies of scale. So how do we dynamically scale our systems to either outgrow a problem or outgrow our own growth problems, but also meeting those demands of like, the ability to pool our resources and also establishing expectations within our current capabilities. A lot of people think that we can just put everything in the cloud. Well, there's a cost to that, right? And so setting those expectations are important.
Yeah. So you've already hinted at my next question here a little bit, but cybersecurity strategies continue to evolve. We've seen many different iterations of this. We're seeing zero trust models in some places, a whole bunch of different architectures. What are you seeing as some of the key elements that need to be part of a robust cybersecurity strategy in whatever form yours takes it?
Yeah, so it really starts with the governance foundation, right? And so I think a lot of people fail to think that like you have to have that governance foundation that actually matches the culture and your business mission. And
Mhm.
so from there in Idaho, like we're working on kind of modernizing and setting that foundation, but also we're focusing on three things within governance: protection, detection, and response. When you think about protection, it's really like how are we preventing bad things from happening to our people, our data, and our systems? And then on detection, we're saying, okay, how do we see when something goes wrong? And then the last thing would be response is, can we actually do something about it, or what can we do about it? And so if you can answer those three questions within your governance framework, you're probably in a pretty good position.
Yeah. No, I think so many people jump into the how do we do this and forget the governance strategies in place. So I really appreciate that perspective. All right, so cybersecurity is one of those that you can obviously never check the box and say we've completed cybersecurity on to the next. It's always evolving and changing and growing. So, as agencies look to expand and maybe change up some of their cybersecurity practices, where can they go wrong? What are some things that they should be looking out for as they go about modernizing their security architectures?
Yeah, so and I'll go back to the governance thing. So they don't set a good governance foundation that works with their business's mission, their needs, and their culture. And so from there, it kind of just goes downhill on unrealistic expectations, rules that people can't or won't follow, and then ultimately, kind of add old age that the leadership doesn't support it, and that just crumbles. The next thing would be awareness. And so oftentimes from what I've seen in just, my career is that too many of the risks are unknown in our environments. And so we have people making assumptions that things are just fine and are protected, but nobody's really validating that. And then the last thing would be people have overridden security controls and say, well, we'll go ahead and document that later, but there's really a lack of accountability. When we decide to accept risk, one, we need to understand it. Next, we need to define it. And the third is actually need to document it. And then the last thing would be over reliance on those silver bullet tools. There's a lot of vendors out there. I don't know. I mean, my inbox is spammed constantly with all of these vendors saying they've got the magic solution, the silver
Uh-huh.
bullet for all my problems, right? And
Yep.
oftentimes we overload our staffs with alert fatigue. Essentially, there's just too much noise coming in and too many problems hitting them, and they really can't solve them all, right?
Yep.
And so the other thing to realize is in working with the reality of your culture, I'll go back to that a little bit, is transparency. So Idaho is a transparent state. You see behind me, there's our task org.
Oh,
That's something that you can request and get, right? And so I don't need to worry about sitting there focusing on my energy on just hiding and concealing that all the time, because that's something that the public has a right to know in Idaho, right? Now, when we talk about sensitive information or things that we want to protect, like social security numbers and stuff like that, that's where we have a good governance framework to kind of weed out those, but also focusing our attention on the areas that actually we can solve and not worrying about the ones that, hey, like for example, our culture doesn't allow us to keep too many secrets because we're a transparent state.
Well, that is wonderful to kind of hear that level of transparency because you don't get that from every organization for non-sensitive information. Obviously, no one's
Yeah.
no one's arguing the latter, of course. One of the things that you mentioned is all of this noise in these vendors coming in and saying, we've got the magic bullet. You sprinkle those magic AI words on top of it, and all of a sudden bots are saving the day or whatever is happening. How do you best, and this gets to my next question, how do you best understand what is real and how things have kind of evolved? And by that, I mean there's no magic bullet, but there are obviously, with each iteration here of the different tools and processes, there's steps being taken forward. So, how do you kind of parse through this information and understand what's really going to be helpful and what's just kind of fluff and the glitter on top of a cake?
Well, okay, so we look at the trends, right? And so we've got like kind of three trends. One is the shift to the cloud and the
Hmm.
internet's everywhere. The next one is automation. I mean, we've had automation for a long time, but automation is shifting to being more valuable to more of a partner in decision making versus just doing a simple on-off task. And then the last thing is the fundamental shift of the risk understanding between organizations going from the it's never going to happen to us, holding everything dear, to okay, now we need to figure out when it does happen, how do we be more resilient with it, right? So I'll go back to the first one with that understanding the shift of the cloud and the internet. And so that's really just understanding that like the economies of scales of threat actors today is somebody in a basement somewhere in somebody's pick a country, doesn't matter, anywhere on the planet. They can launch a large scale cyber attack on the elderly in Idaho, or on a state agency in Idaho, or on a county in Idaho, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to realize the world has changed on the ability for folks to cheaply attack other people. And so
Mhm.
realizing that, like, okay, so I know that this is the actual environment. Now, in that sea of buzzwords, like what actually can I do about that, right? And so that's again working with your culture of understanding, like, okay, with my people, my data, and my systems, like what can I actually protect, and then where am I going to actually take a risk? Now, when we talk about AI, we're I would say embrace it.
Hmm.
Don't try and fight it. You know, you're never going to fight true progress. You don't fight the clock with time. You can't stop the sun, at least not with our abilities. And so realizing that you're not going to stop this evolution in AI. So really what it comes down to is making sure that we set the framework to where we can have prudent risk acceptance within this AI architecture and leveraging it, right? So you think about this as we have billions and trillions of things impacting our parameters, threat postures, flying, whatever it is. The internet's a dirty place. We have to use AI to filter out all of that noise to get down to the 10 to 15 things that we really need to focus on. And then the next thing would be is understanding that, you know, bad things are going to happen, and making sure you've got alternate, redundant, resilient ways to keep your business process going.
I appreciate that. All right, two final questions for you. I'm curious, you've talked about some of the initiatives that your team has worked on. So from that perspective, how have you seen either your organization or other successful organizations really modernize or transform their security processes or procedures? What are some things that you see that they've done?
So I can speak from Idaho and what we're doing here in Idaho, but essentially what we've done is we're operationalizing the role of the CISO, and we're realizing that we need to have a focus on resilience, but also like we're thinking of cyber and security, you know, they're one and the same, as
Yeah.
a service that enables operation. And so it's the CISO's role to really figure out how do we operate in this dangerous place in the most secure fashion, but not realizing that we're in the way, we're enabling those business objectives, right? And so the next thing is we're getting to build that cyber governance foundation that matches our culture and our organization, and then leveraging those existing capabilities we have in our environment to not create more noise in our environment, but leveraging the things we have to kind of tackle those problem sets of people, data, and systems. And then taking that, that's protection. And then the next thing would be detection, is defining that organizational common operating picture. Like of all the sea of data that we have coming in, like how do we actually put together on the wall kind of like the things that we need to care about so that we can detect the actual threats that we can do something about. And then the last thing is working with our strategic partners, not just here at the state, but realizing that it's a herd mentality. And so we need to be able to work with all of our supported state agencies, our cities, our counties, our schools. We work with the National Guard, et cetera. We have a national lab. We work with all of them to come up with capabilities that we can respond. We know bad things are going to happen. And so really what we're doing is training the competencies for when that bad thing happens, how do we restore services? And that's kind of the three things we're focusing on. Essentially, it's like working with your reality and
Yeah.
just understanding there's no ideal state when it comes to cyber.
I know I've heard some folks say in the security space that they don't want to be the agency of no anymore. You used to like put up a thing and say, no, you can't access this. No, you can't use this. And people would go around it and create other security vulnerabilities and things like that. And so trying to rethink it as a collaborative piece of the puzzle, not it's over here in our security shop, but kind of embedded into the process overall makes things run a little bit smoother. And it sounds like you're touching a little bit on that and kind of what you were describing, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so final question here. Cybersecurity is and will always be kind of a focus and key area for agencies. So, folks who are attending today's training, is there one or two things you want them to be thinking about? Not all of them are going to be security practitioners. So, any takeaways that you have for them that you want them to consider as they're kind of operating within these networks?
Yeah. So, you know, if you think about it, I mean, I touched on these various things, but if you're doing a function, if you're providing a service, if you have a task or a mission, think of, okay, do I have, you know, kind of the things that we talked about, which is like, okay, do I have a set of rules that I operate by?
Mhm.
And then do I have things that would protect me from something bad happen? Like, what do I have? Like, when I go outside, I put on clothes to protect me from getting sunburn or from getting too cold, right? But I don't want to just have one thing. Like, I layer up, like, if it's really cold out
Yeah.
or like on the internet, really dirty. You want to layer up, right? And so, do I have layers so if one thing fails, I have not completely game over? The next thing is when am I able to detect when something's wrong? And so you think about, okay, my body has sensors in it, and
Mhm.
that, you know, if it gets too hot, like I start sweating, right? There's indications something's wrong. And so figuring out, do I have some ability to actually detect when things aren't right? And then the last thing is do we have an ability to actually do something about it? Like, what can I actually do? Like, if I get into a building and there's a fire, have I recognized that there's doors and things like that that get out of the fire? Or do I need to grab a fire extinguisher and help put out the fire, right? And so understanding, like, when there is a problem, what are those things I can actually do about it? And the ultimate thing would be is, that gets into resilience, but really it's working with the realities that you have. And so don't try and solve all the world's problems. Just focus on the problems you have, the threats you have, and the capabilities you have to solve those problems.
I love that example. And I have a little toddler running around. And as you were talking about, if it's hot or cold outside, you're dressing appropriately. That also has me thinking about the maturity of your cybersecurity system because the toddler's not looking for points of exit and a fire. They're running around aimlessly. So you have to have that governance in place, that level of maturity in place, so that you can kind of see some of these key things that you were talking about. So I really appreciate that analogy, Jared. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. And that is all we have for you. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Cybersecurity policy is undergoing a transition, just like the federal government is with the new administration and President Trump coming in. So, my colleague Candace Thorson sat down with Kevin Green from Beyond Trust to understand the impact of the new administration on cybersecurity strategy going forward. Here's that conversation.
I think we need to really figure out a way to act in the harmony of the national cybersecurity strategy, and I do think the new administration will kind of double down on this as well. With the need to disrupt threat actors, I think we need to figure out a way how do we be be more preventive and do more things proactively early so that we can detect and prevent attacks early in the attack life cycle, so that we never get to a point where no one ever sees the data leaving, because I think that's part of the problem. No one ever sees the data leaving and we see these breaches. So I do think the need to defend and protect for it becomes very important in building responsive cyber defense capabilities so that we can be more resilient against attacks. And I also think the other thing takeaways is we have to figure out a way to fix the broken pieces around software. I talk about this all the time. Software security is our first line of defense. If we're not building better software, I think we're in trouble. And one of the things I always advocate and hopefully advocate for, and I wrote about it around one of the things I would like to see the new administration work on is the ability to really understand whether or not the SDLC activities practices actually produce the intended outcomes that we expect, right? Everyone wants to talk about secure software, but is secure software an attainable goal? Should we be focusing on resilient software? And resilient software is about no matter what type of attack or situation you're in, the software is going to be resilient against these potential threats, these 0 days that we see. So I do think we really need to figure out a way, how do we improve software security and figure out a way how to incentivize key suppliers and people who are building software on behalf of the government. So if we do these things, I think we can make tremendous strides in our cybersecurity posture, which will ultimately elevate our national cyber defense.
Thanks so much, Kevin and Candace. I have to say, with big changes in administrations come similar sized policy shifts. So I appreciate you walking us through those challenges. Thanks so much. Here to talk about all things security is Anish Patel, who is the head of federal civilian at Cloudflare. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and look forward to the conversation today.
So, security, this is a huge topic. So, I want you to lay the groundwork for me a little bit. Where are agencies running into pain points or challenges when they are connecting to the internet or using applications, things that we're doing every day? Where are they running into those security challenges?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. Well, the internet is only becoming more pervasive, and things are only going to get more connected. That's not a surprise to anyone that's probably listening to this podcast or this video. Is this a podcast or a video? Reset that.
Video interview, but you can call it whatever you want.
Restate that comment.
Of course.
Yeah, that's a good question. The internet, of course, is only becoming more pervasive and things are only going to get more connected. So the connectivity that you need for your applications, your users, whatever it might be, we all know that the minute something is open to the internet, it's open to attack. And I think that's really the area that folks have been trying to solve for quite some time. Agencies, just like commercial entities and businesses, they struggle with like increase in cost or complexity or the risk of just connecting it all, right? And so everybody wants things to be more connected. Everybody wants things to be more modernized and work on their mobile phone and any type of device they want to use from anywhere in the world. So for an IT leader, there's just really this sense of kind of a lack of control, right? How do you control all those factors when you want the best experience, but you don't have the budget to be able to do that? Or you may have the budget, but you don't have the manpower, and there's a lot of complexity there. And so I think that's really the thing that Cloudflare tries to help folks address.
Very, very cool. And I appreciate you laying that groundwork because I know as a user myself, I've been through plenty of security trainings and perhaps I've connected to some unsecured networks in the past. So I think it's always like a great reminder that these risks are really apparent, like you said, and only going to continue to grow. So any examples or use cases besides the example I just gave here of how an employee could be a security risk to their organization?
Yeah. So yeah, that question, both from an employee side or just a constituent using a service. I mean, the modernization of services that we just talked about across the internet becoming more pervasive. Today, that means like being able to request and receive services without having to go somewhere in person is a big deal, right? For through the COVID period and now after, people just kind of expect, well, even for going to your doctor, you don't always need to show up. You could do telehealth. Or if you want to travel now that restrictions are open, well, you need a renewal of your passport. Like, why do I have to go into a post office to do that? Which you don't anymore because the consular affairs has modernized that, right? And so if you think about all these like traditional government services that required an in-person visit for the sake of traditional processes, that's the thing that we try to, as an organization, Cloudflare, and then as a government entity as a whole, and this kind of industry as a whole is trying to modernize that experience. For an employee, that means like, well, if we're digitizing something that was written down on a form and put in a binder to now being obviously available online in digital form, it is susceptible to an attack. And that risk reward scenario is something that everybody struggles with, but everybody wants to lean towards the convenience of that customer experience and being able to do it remotely. And so there's some level of risk acceptable, but as a government agency, trust in government or rebuilding trust in government is kind of the key thing, right? Otherwise, all these services fail. And even if you provide a great experience, you just won't have the trust of the people. And so how do we take whether it's an employee or a user that's accessing the government services, like, how do you help those folks like stay connected in a secure way? Sometimes they don't even know that the threat vector is a threat vector. If you think about the most common way that this happens, a phishing email somebody sends, the common theme seems to be a CEO is asking you to buy a gift card for him, which obviously is not a legitimate thing, and most people know that now. But you might be an admin or a user who have access to a system that you need to log into. And today, with all the modern things that hackers have access to, it's pretty easy for them to build a form with perfect English and perfect graphics. And it looks exactly like the form that you'd be signing into. And you may accidentally input your credentials, right? So how do you prevent a lot of this stuff that's happening in the threat landscape? That's really the area that as an industry we are focusing on.
Thanks so much, Anish. I think when it comes to strategy, considering identity is clearly a fundamental tenet. So I appreciate you sharing that with us today. here to talk about all things cybersecurity is Christian Rodriguez, who is the Field Chief Technology Officer for Americas at CrowdStrike. Christian, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad
So,
to be here.
cybersecurity, that is an enormous topic. So, I want you to take a step back for me and lay the groundwork a little bit. What does the current cybersecurity landscape really look like for government agencies right now?
No, that's a good question. I think it's very similar to what we're seeing across a multitude of industries. But adversaries are getting faster at launching their attacks. They are becoming very nimble with respect to the techniques and the tactics that they use. They're refining their approaches. They are targeting identities. We're seeing a lot of that on the government side. And then we're also seeing an increase of signs of what we call cross-domain threats. So essentially, think of the bad guys, right, or gals, targeting a multitude of resources that government agencies have access to, and that's really a combination of identities. It's the devices, it's cloud infrastructure. It's basically any type of resource that can potentially be exploited in some capacity. And these adversaries are living within these environments, knowing how to access these resources, and ultimately embed themselves into these environments for as long as they can, so that they blend in with normal user behavior and what appears to be normal activity. But what their ultimate objectives are can be tied to anything from stealing data to being very disruptive with techniques like ransomware, or simply collecting intellectual property for nation state level type of espionage efforts. And so on the government side, it's interesting because those efforts, when we talk about nation state, they can be very multifaceted, right? Where adversaries look for the resources that are really the path of least resistance, usually in some identity type of fashion. And then from there, it's the monitoring of data, exfiltrating that data, and then kind of leaving quietly if they can.
So, with that kind of landscape that you articulated so well there, one of the concepts or strategies that agencies are utilizing to kind of combat some of this is this concept of zero trust. Tell me about what zero trust is and how it's playing a role in government.
Yeah, so zero trust is a framework that has been adopted by the likes of CISA, for example. And it ultimately outlines these multiple pillars of how you should approach protecting your assets, right? And that includes things like infrastructure, and it includes data, and it includes identities, for example. And I think it's a very core principle that most organizations, if adopted well, because there's also a cultural shift that's involved, there's a mindset that needs to be implemented with respect to the way that you document policies, document the way that data is being accessed, understanding who should really be authenticating against different resources, and ultimately who should have access to the data once authenticated. It's this continuous, very cyclical assessment of the way that your business operates or your agency operates, and ultimately implementing policies around least privilege, for example, on ensuring that the identity that's accessing that resource should ultimately be the person that should indeed have access to it. So I think in terms of the fundamentals behind zero trust, I think it's absolutely crucial. I think it's core. I don't think it should be ignored, or I don't think it should ever be considered. It's a guidance, right, if you will, right, with respect to here are best practices if we're trying to stop the adversary from getting access to your data or compromising a resource. It's absolutely crucial, but it even lends itself to insider threat analysis, right? So if we're talking about someone that inadvertently sends, some type of information outside the organization, or we're talking about a potential data loss scenario, or if we're talking about someone that's intentionally trying to steal information, that model should encompass a variety of different attack or really a variety of different risks that are tied to the loss of information or controlling the access to different resources. So I think it's still very crucial. I think we're still seeing many agencies mature to the point where they can adopt that model in its entirety, if you will. But I think it's an absolutely core and foundational principle that and framework that most agencies should adopt.
Thanks so much, Christian. I really appreciate your clear articulation of the challenges and opportunity around least privileged access and zero trust. So thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today. From where and how agencies obtain their new products and services is central for security of the organization. My colleague John Monroe asked Juniper's Tom Van Meter key capabilities and strategies agencies should employ to stay as secure as possible.
Let's talk about kind of the makeup of a modern network infrastructure. And I think one of the first concerns is that kind of mission critical communications piece. That's obviously a big concern. So, what are some of the kind of key capabilities or key issues that agencies should be looking for?
If it's in a critical security environment, you've got to absolutely have a trusted supply chain, right? You need to make sure that when your equipment that you install in this critical infrastructure is there, it's the equipment you expect it to be. It's not just necessarily TAA, but you need to, a lot of vendors put device IDs in their equipment to verify that it's theirs and that you're not getting somebody's cheap knockoffs so that they can make money on the side. So you need a trusted supply chain. Your design of your network needs to be highly available, both in systems and in the network itself. So if you can get a highly available system and then you design the network as a whole in a highly available manner, that will keep your mission critical functions alive. Because it's mission critical, you're going to be concerned with encryption. So for example, even if it's nothing more than an SSH into the device or an HTTPS connection in the GUI to the device, you need to have confidence that your certification algorithms, your encryption algorithms are certified. So at a minimum, CAVP, cryptographic algorithm validation program, that's where you get a certificate that says your encryption algorithms are implemented correctly. And then you need an entropy certificate because you need to make sure that the entropy with which you're seeding your key generation is solid so that it doesn't make it easier for someone to brute force your attacks. And of course, the last thing is you'd want to do best practices for design. Ideally, you're using standards-based designs and standards-based products, but at a minimum, you need best practices for design. So those are things I keep in mind for a critical infrastructure.
Okay, great. Now, so another big issue, of course, is zero trust. You know, government is going zero trust. So, what are some of the key capabilities that agencies should look for to really support that shift to zero trust security?
So, the first thing I'd say is you actually don't have to wait. Zero trust is implemented by all major firewall vendors. So, NIST SP 800-207 is the zero trust document, and it defines 3 different ways that you can implement zero trust. One of them is microsegmentation, and it turns out if you've got a layer 7 next generation firewall, then you can implement firewall rules that answer the question words you learned in high school, you know, who, what, where, when, how, why, those things. You just have to get a license from your vendor, and all major vendors support layer 7 next generation firewalls, or at least they say they do. And you can go ahead and you can write security policies based on those question words. So-and-so who gets access to what? Maybe it's a database or it's an application at a specific time of day. So if they work from the office and they're trying to access at 10 o'clock at night from home, maybe that doesn't get allowed. So you set these policy rules up that enable that. You don't have to wait for somebody to come in and say, we're going to redo zero trust. You can start today. If you've ever read the DoD zero trust architecture document, it's close to an inch thick. It's very complete. A little bit tough to read if you're not used to that language. You've got CISA with their 5 pillars of zero trust and trying to integrate them all together. But at the end of the day, it practically turns into, do you have the layer 7 next generation firewall rules and an IPS turned on? And you can do those. And then practically speaking, how do you do it when you do those layer 7 next generation firewall rules? Do it like Lego blocks. You go out there and you say, oh, wow, let me put a Lego block in front of this enclave. And what's an enclave? An enclave, it could be your HR department, your engineering department. The reality is people in engineering don't need access to HR information and vice versa. So you put policy rules protecting the engineering to only people who need to access engineering, and you put policy rules to HR so that only people who need access to HR can get access. And that doesn't have to be a separate firewall. It could be. There's nothing that says you couldn't put a separate firewall in front of each group. You could just home run that access back to some centrally located access, firewalls. You still have your perimeter firewall. You wouldn't home run the enclaves back to the perimeter firewall, but you'd have other firewalls centrally located within your enterprise. You could home run them back to those firewalls, and that would give you a very good security implementation and infrastructure. But you don't have to wait for someone to come in and do it. You can just start implementing it already. And I would recommend that you pick a friendly group to start it with that has a low mission criticality, so you can get some lessons learned as you write those policy rules and learn how they work. And once you get that ironed out with a small group, then you can go ahead and start doing your critical infrastructure groups. This is more important than that. And that's where you start after you get your lessons learned.
Thanks so much, Tom and John, for that breakdown of zero trust and the supply chain. Those best practices certainly gave me a lot to think about. So thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time today. I want to thank our wonderful speakers for sharing their insights with us today. It was a lot of information on cybersecurity, which is something we should all be keeping a close eye on. So I really appreciate that. I do have a few quick reminders before everyone logs off today. First things first, if you haven't already, check out that resources tab. There are lots of great learning opportunities over there, so you want to check that out. We will also be sending you a link to the on-demand version of this training, so look for that in your inboxes tomorrow. But on behalf of GovLoop, CrowdStrike, Cloudflare, Juniper, and BeyondTrust, I hope you enjoyed this session. And as always, we really appreciate and value the work that you do, so thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next training.